where we uncover the forgotten stories that shaped our nation today. We're diving into one of the most brilliant tactical victories in American military history. A battle so perfectly executed that it's still studied in military academies around the world. Yet, most Americans have never heard of it. Picture this. It's January 1781, and the American Revolution is hanging by a thread. The British have conquered most of the South. Charleston has fallen. Savannah is in enemy hands. Continental forces are scattered and demoralized. The cause of independence seems lost, but in the rolling hills of South Carolina, an aging frontiersman named Daniel Morgan is about to pull off the most daring tactical masterpiece in American history. What makes this battle extraordinary isn't just that the Americans won, it's how they won. Morgan took everything the military textbooks said you should never do, turned it upside down, and created a strategy so unexpected that his enemy walked straight into a trap that would change the course of the war forever. The year 1780 had been disastrous for American forces in the South after the crushing defeat at Camden, where General Horatio Gates fled the battlefield faster than his own soldiers. Morale had collapsed completely. The British seemed unstoppable under the iron-fisted command of Lord Charles Cornwallis, a veteran of European warfare who brought old-world military precision to the American frontier. Cornwallis was systematically conquering the southern colonies with brutal efficiency that terrified patriots everywhere, using a strategy of terror and intimidation that had already brought Georgia and much of South Carolina under British control. The situation was so desperate that many patriots had given up entirely. Loyalist militias were emerging throughout the South, often settling old scores with their patriot neighbors under the protection of British arms. It seemed as though the revolution might simply collapse in the South, leaving only New England and the mid-Atlantic states to continue the fight if they could. But Nathaniel Greene, the new Southern commander appointed by Washington himself, had a completely different vision. Greene was a Rhode Island Quaker who had been expelled from his meeting for taking up arms, a man who combined deep, strategic thinking with a close understanding of Southern geography and culture. Instead of trying to match British strength with strength or strategy that had failed terribly at Camden, he would divide his forces, something every military manual warned against. He sent Daniel Morgan west with about 1,000 men while he took the main force east. This would force Cornwallis to split his own army to pursue both American forces, potentially weakening both British groups. Greene's strategy was based on a deep understanding of the nature of warfare in the American South. Unlike the European battlefields where Cornwallis had learned his trade, the American South was a vast expanse of forests, swamps, and rivers where conventional European tactics often failed. Here, local knowledge mattered more than drill manual precision, and the support of the civilian population could make the difference between victory and defeat. Cornwallis took the bait exactly as Greene hoped. The British commander, confident in his superior training and equipment, decided to divide his own forces to pursue both American armies at the same time. He sent his most aggressive and successful subordinate, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, to hunt down Morgan's western force. It was a decision that would prove to be one of the most important of the entire war. Tarleton was known throughout the South as Bloody Band, a 26-year-old cavalry officer whose reputation for ruthless pursuit and merciless treatment of defeated enemies had made him the most feared British commander in the Southern theater. Born into a wealthy Liverpool merchant family, Tarleton had purchased his commission and risen rapidly through the ranks through a combination of natural military talent and absolute ruthlessness. He commanded the British Legion, a mixed force of cavalry and infantry recruited largely from American loyalists. And he had built his fearsome reputation through a series of crushing victories against Patriot forces. Tarleton's most infamous moment had come at the Waxhaws, where he had massacred Patriot forces attempting to surrender. earning him the nickname Butcher and making Tarleton's Quarter synonymous with no mercy given. The psychological impact of Tarleton's reputation cannot be overstated. Many American militiamen would simply flee at the first report of his approach, without even attempting to fight. If anyone could catch and destroy Morgan's force, it was Tarleton. His British Legion moved with lightning speed through the South Carolina backcountry, covering distances that seemed impossible and appearing where enemies least expected them. Cornwallis had given Tarleton clear orders: find Morgan and destroy his force completely, leaving no organized American resistance in the Western Carolinas. Daniel Morgan, meanwhile, was a completely different type of soldier. Born on the Virginia frontier, he had spent his youth as a teamster and laborer before joining the military during the French and Indian War. Unlike the aristocratic Tarleton, Morgan had risen through the ranks through merit alone, earning his position through demonstrated courage and tactical brilliance rather than wealth or connections. Morgan's early military experience had been harsh. As a young man, he had struck a British officer and received 499 lashes as punishment, one less than the 500 that would have killed him. This brutal treatment had left him with a deep understanding of both British military methods and their limitations, as well as a close knowledge of what motivated common soldiers. During the early years of the Revolution, Morgan had commanded a unit of Virginia riflemen whose marksmanship and woodcraft had made them legendary. These men could hit targets at ranges that seemed impossible to European-trained soldiers. They fought with a frontier independence that often frustrated conventional commanders, but proved devastatingly effective in the right circumstances. Now, in late 1780, Morgan was 44 years old and suffering from arthritis and sciatica that left him barely able to ride a horse, but his mind remained sharp, and his understanding of both conventional and unconventional warfare was unmatched among American commanders. He knew he was being hunted by the most dangerous British commander in the South, and he knew that his force was exactly the kind of mixed unit that usually fell apart under pressure. Morgan's army was indeed a ragtag collection that would have horrified European military observers. His corps consisted of about 300 Continental regulars professional soldiers who had signed up for the duration of the war and had been trained in European-style linear tactics. But the majority of his force consisted of militia farmers, shopkeepers, and frontiersmen who served for short terms and had limited formal military training. The militia were notorious for their unreliability in conventional battle. Time and again throughout the war, militia units had fired a few shots and then fled when faced with British regulars advancing with fixed bayonets. Even George Washington, who respected the militia's value in guerrilla warfare, had little faith in their ability to stand up in conventional battle against professional soldiers. But Morgan understood his men better than most commanders. He knew that the militia's tendency to retreat wasn't necessarily cowardice. It was often sound tactical sense. Citizen soldiers had families and farms to return to. They couldn't afford to die in futile, heroic stands. But if given a role that matched their capabilities and psychology, they could be devastatingly effective. As Tarleton closed in during the second week of January 1781, Morgan made a decision that seemed like military suicide. Instead of continuing to retreat toward the relative safety of the North Carolina mountains, he would make a stand. But where he chose to fight seemed to guarantee defeat. The place was called Cowpens, named for the cattle pens that local farmers had built in the area. It was a relatively open area of rolling grassland, dotted with scattered trees, surrounded by denser forest. Most importantly, from a military perspective, it had the broad river at its back, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Every military principle screamed that this was wrong. The most basic rule of warfare was to never fight with a major obstacle behind you that would prevent withdrawal. But Morgan understood something about psychology that his British opponent did. Sometimes when men know they can't retreat, they fight harder than they ever thought possible. The knowledge that flight was impossible could focus the mind wonderfully and turn ordinary soldiers into heroes. Moreover, Morgan had spent months studying his enemy, and he knew Tarleton's weaknesses intimately. Tarleton was undoubtedly brave and tactically skilled, but he was also impulsive and arrogant. His string of easy victories against American forces had made him overconfident, and he had developed a tendency to attack immediately upon contact rather than taking time for proper reconnaissance and preparation. Morgan was betting that Tarleton's eagerness for another quick victory would blind him to the trap being prepared. On the night of January 16, 1781, Morgan gathered his officers and explained his battle plan. What he proposed was so unconventional that some of his subordinates thought their commander had finally succumbed to the pressure of constant retreat and pursuit. Morgan planned to arrange his forces in 3 lines, but not the way any European army would deploy them. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity and psychological insight. Instead of trying to make his militia behave like Continental regulars, Morgan would use them exactly as they were, men who would fight for a while and then retreat when pressed too hard. But he would make that natural tendency part of his battle plan rather than a weakness to be overcome. In the front line, about 150 yards forward of his main position, Morgan placed his least reliable troops, local militia, armed with hunting rifles. These were farmers and frontiersmen who were excellent individual marksmen but had little experience in formal military maneuvers. Morgan's instructions to them were refreshingly honest. I don't expect you to stand and fight like Continental soldiers. I want you to fire 2 volleys, aim for the officers, and then retreat behind the second line. Don't be ashamed of it. It's your job, and you'll be helping win the battle. This was military heresy. Conventional wisdom held that you put your best troops in front to absorb the enemy's initial assault. But Morgan was thinking several moves ahead. He wanted the British to see American militia retreating, because that would make them overconfident and careless in their pursuit. Behind the first line, about 150 yards back, he placed his second line, more experienced militia under the command of Andrew Pickens, a Presbyterian elder who had proven himself as a partisan fighter. These men had more military experience than the first line, and their job was to slow down the British advance with disciplined volleys before falling back to reform on the flanks of the third line. The third line, positioned on a low hill that dominated the battlefield, consisted of Morgan's most reliable troops, Continental regulars under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard, and Virginia militia who had proven themselves in previous battles. These men would have to absorb the main British assault after it had been weakened and disrupted by the first 2 lines. Finally, Morgan positioned Lieutenant Colonel William Washington's cavalry behind the hill, completely out of sight of approaching enemies. Washington, a distant cousin of the commander-in-chief, commanded about 80 Continental dragoons and mounted militiamen who would provide the decisive striking power at the crucial moment. The genius of Morgan's plan lay in its understanding of both his own men's psychology and that of his enemies. He was using his army's perceived weaknesses as strengths, turning the natural fighting instincts of citizen soldiers into tactical advantages rather than trying to force them into European military molds that didn't fit American conditions. But the plan required perfect timing and coordination. Each line had to perform its role precisely, and the cavalry had to strike at exactly the right moment. Most challenging of all, the plan required Morgan's men to trust him completely, even when everything seemed to be going wrong. As dawn broke on January 17, 1781, Tarleton's force appeared through the morning mist. The British commander had pushed his men hard through the night, covering the final distance to Cowpens in darkness to achieve tactical surprise. He had about 1,100 men, slightly larger than Morgan's force and vastly superior in training. equipment, and recent battle experience. Tarleton's army represented some of the finest troops in British service. The 7th Royal Fusiliers were veteran infantry with years of experience in European and American warfare. The 17th Light Dragoons were elite cavalry whose reputation extended throughout the British Empire. The British Legion, Tarleton's own unit, combined the mobility of cavalry with the firepower of infantry, and they had proven devastatingly effective in the fluid warfare of the Southern Campaign. Supporting these elite units were detachments of the 71st Highland Regiment, fierce Scottish soldiers whose distinctive uniforms and reputation for battlefield courage made them both respected and feared. Artillery support came from 2 3-pounder cannons that could sweep the battlefield with devastating grapeshot. When Tarleton saw the American position, his confidence soared. The rebels had finally been cornered with nowhere to run exactly as he had hoped. He could see the militia in the front line, already looking nervous and uncertain. Many were glancing back toward the river, clearly calculating their chances of escape. This looked like every other battle Tarleton had fought in. The South American militia would fire a ragged volley or two and then flee in panic, leaving the Continental regulars to be overwhelmed by superior British discipline and cold steel. Tarleton's tactical assessment seemed sound. His men were fresh and confident, having won every significant engagement of the Southern Campaign. The Americans were trapped against the river with no line of retreat, and their deployment looked amateurish. 2 eyes trained in European military methods. Why would any competent commander put his weakest troops in front and his strongest in the rear? The British commander made his dispositions quickly. The 7th Fusiliers and British Legion infantry would form the main battle line, with the 17th Light Dragoons on the right flank to prevent any American attempt to escape in that direction. The 71st Highlanders would form a reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough, while the artillery would unlimber and advance. Tarleton ordered an immediate attack, barely allowing his men time to form proper battle lines. This was his standard tactic: hit the Americans hard and fast before they had time to organize effective resistance. It had worked at Waxhaws, at Fishing Creek, and in a dozen other engagements. There was no reason to think Cowpens would be any different. The British advanced with drums beating and colors flying, presenting an intimidating spectacle of military precision and power. Red-coated soldiers moved in perfect formation across the grassland, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun, their officers mounted and conspicuous in their gold braid and gorgets. From their perspective, this was just another chapter in Britain's inevitable conquest of the rebellious southern colonies. As the redcoats came within range, Morgan's first line of militia opened fire. The frontiersmen were excellent marksmen, and their rifles were far more accurate than British muskets at long range. Several British officers fell from their horses, and gaps appeared in the advancing line as soldiers dropped. But the British formation barely wavered. These were professional soldiers trained to advance steadily despite casualties, trusting in their discipline and the superiority of British arms. The militia fired their second volley, again aiming for officers as Morgan had instructed. More British soldiers fell, but the advance continued relentlessly. Then, exactly as Morgan had planned and Tarleton expected, the American front line began to retreat to the British. This looked like the beginning of another American collapse, the familiar pattern of initial resistance, followed by a rapid flight. But something was subtly different, though Tarleton was too focused on pursuit to notice the details. The militia weren't fleeing in wild panic. They were conducting an organized withdrawal, moving back through the woods on either side of the battlefield, rather than running straight back toward the river, where they would interfere with the second line. This should have been a warning sign to experienced military eyes, But British confidence was so high in their expectation of easy victory, so strong that they missed the significance of what they were seeing. The Americans were retreating, just as they always did. That was all that mattered. The British pressed forward eagerly, pursuing the retreating militia, their formation beginning to lose its precise geometry as officers urged their men forward and soldiers quickened their pace in anticipation of victory. They ran into Pickens' second line, which had been waiting in disciplined formation behind scattered trees. The second line delivered a devastating volley at closer range than the first, dropping more British soldiers and officers. But again, after firing, they began to retreat, just as the first line had done. British confidence soared even higher. The Americans were breaking everywhere, just as they always did when faced with British steel and determination. Tarkenton spurred his men forward, sensing complete victory within his grasp. His soldiers charged up the hill toward Morgan's third line, where the Continental regulars waited in disciplined formation. But the British were no longer the neat, organized formation that had begun the attack. Their pursuit of the retreating militia had strung them out across the battlefield, disrupted their formations, and left many soldiers winded from the uphill charge. Moreover, the loss of officers was beginning to tell. British tactics relied heavily on officer leadership, and the accurate fire of American riflemen had systematically targeted these key figures. Junior officers were trying to maintain unit cohesion, but the smooth coordination of the British advance was beginning to fray. The Continental line, anchored by John Eager Howard's Maryland and Delaware regulars, waited with disciplined patience as the disorganized British assault approached. These were veteran soldiers who had survived Valley Forge and fought in the major battles of the Northern Theater. They knew how to load and fire rapidly, how to use their bayonets effectively, and most importantly, how to stand steady under fire. When the British came within effective musket range, the Continental line delivered a crushing volley that stopped the British advance cold. At close range, American muskets were just as deadly as British ones, and the Continentals had the advantage of firing from a prepared position at enemies, advancing uphill across open ground. For a moment, the battle hung in the balance. The British advance had stalled, but they still had numerical superiority in the momentum of attack. Tarleton's men began to reorganize, with junior officers trying to dress their lines and prepare for another assault. This was the critical moment when battles were typically won or lost. Then Morgan's most daring gambit began to unfold. Instead of continuing to retreat, as British experience led them to expect, something unprecedented happened. The militia began to return to the fight. Pickens had rallied his men in the woods on the American right flank, and they were moving to envelop the British left wing at the same time. The first-line militia, their confidence restored by the apparent success of the plan so far, were reforming on the left's flank. This was completely outside British experienced militia simply didn't rally and return to battle once they had been broken. Yet, here they were, emerging from the woods on both flanks, their rifles loaded and ready for action. The psychological impact on British soldiers was profound. They had thought the battle was won, and now they found themselves facing fresh threats from unexpected directions. Tarleton, realizing that his advance had stalled and that American forces were appearing on his flanks, made a sound tactical decision. He ordered his reserve, the 71st Highlanders and his remaining dragoons, to attack the American right flank where Pickens' militia were forming up. If he could crush this flanking force quickly, he might still salvage victory from what was becoming an increasingly complicated situation. It was a militarily correct decision, but Morgan was ready for it. The old frontiersman had anticipated every move his opponent might make, and he had prepared responses for each possibility. The return of the militia to the battle was proceeding exactly as he had hoped, and now came the most delicate part of his plan. at this crucial moment. John Eager Howard made a decision that nearly ruined everything Morgan had worked to achieve. Seeing pressure building on his right flank as the Highland Reserve moved to attack, Howard ordered his men to refuse the flank, essentially to bend back the right side of his line to meet the threat in the noise and confusion of battle. With the musket fire crackling across the field and men shouting orders that could barely be heard above the din, Howard's command was misunderstood by his subordinates. Instead of bending back the flank, the entire Continental line began to retreat, stepping backward up the hill in what appeared to be the beginning of a general withdrawal. This was the moment that could have meant complete disaster for American arms. Throughout the war, American retreats had a terrible tendency to become uncontrolled routes as discipline broke down and men fled for their lives. The militia, seeing the reliable Continental regulars falling back, might have panicked and fled toward the river, where the entire American force could have been trapped and destroyed. The psychological moment was crucial for the British. Sight of the Continental line retreating looked like the final collapse they had been expecting all morning. These were the best American troops, the ones who had stood firm when the militia ran. If they were breaking, then total victory was assured. But Morgan had spent months building trust and understanding with these men. They had faith in their commander's tactical judgment, and crucially, they understood their role in the larger plan. The Continental officers maintained discipline even as they conducted a fighting withdrawal, keeping their men in formation and continuing to return fire as they moved. Instead of panicking, the Continental line conducted one of the most difficult military maneuvers possible, fighting withdrawal under fire. They maintained their formation, continued to engage the enemy, and moved backward in good order, while great British soldiers pressed forward eagerly in what they thought was pursuit of a beaten foe. To the British, this looked like the final confirmation of victory. The Continental line was finally breaking, just as the militia had broken before them. Tarkenton ordered a general advance, calling on his men to press forward and complete the destruction of American resistance. His exhausted soldiers, sensing triumph at last, pushed forward in pursuit of what they believed were fleeing Americans. This was exactly what Morgan had been waiting for. Throughout the entire engagement, as the British line became disordered and extended in their eager pursuit, he sprang the trap that he had been preparing from the moment he chose to fight at Cowpens. His signal. Three things happened simultaneously with devastating effect. First, the retreating Continental line suddenly turned about and delivered a point-blank volley into the pursuing British soldiers. The range was so close that the musket balls tore through multiple ranks, and the surprise was so complete that many British soldiers simply stopped in their tracks, unable to comprehend what had happened. Second, the militia forces on both flanks, now fully reformed and filled with confidence by the apparent success of the battle plan, attacked the British flanks in a coordinated pincer movement. Pickens, men on the right, and the first-line militia on the left closed in simultaneously, catching the British in a deadly crossfire. Third, and most dramatically, William Washington's cavalry thundered out from behind the hill, where they had remained hidden throughout the entire battle. 80 horsemen struck the British rear like a thunderbolt, completing the encirclement and turning what had seemed like British victory into American triumph. In a matter of minutes, the entire character of the battle changed completely. The hunters became the hunted. The pursuers became the pursued. The British army found itself surrounded on all sides, taking fire from front, rear, and both flanks simultaneously. Their neat formations dissolved into chaos as men tried desperately to face threats coming from every direction at once. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical assault. British soldiers, who moments before had been confidently pursuing beaten Americans, suddenly found themselves trapped in a deadly killing box With nowhere to turn, officers tried desperately to rally their men in formed squares to repel cavalry. But the surprise was so complete and the confusion so total that coordinated resistance became impossible. Tarkenton attempted to rally his troops, spurring his horse through the chaos and shouting orders that could barely be heard above the sound of musket fire and screaming horses. The 17th Light Dragoons made a desperate charge to try to break through the American line, but they were met by Washington's cavalry in a thunderous collision of horses and sabers that left men and animals scattered across the grass. The British infantry, caught in the deadly crossfire and unable to form effective resistance, began to surrender in groups. White flags appeared throughout the battlefield as soldiers threw down their muskets and raised their hands. The battle that had begun as a typical British pursuit of fleeing Americans had become a tactical masterpiece of encirclement and destruction that would be studied in military academies for generations to come. Entire engagement had lasted less than an hour, but in that brief time, Daniel Morgan had achieved one of the most complete tactical victories in military history. The casualties tell the story of just how devastating American success had been. Of Tarkenton's 1,100 men, over 110 were killed outright. More than 200 were wounded, and 500 were captured, along with their equipment and colors. The material losses were equally staggering: 2 artillery pieces, 800 muskets, 100 horses, 35 wagons, and the regimental colors of some of Britain's finest units fell into American hands. Most importantly, the aura of invincibility that had surrounded British arms in the South was shattered completely. Morgan's losses, by contrast, were almost negligible: killed in 61, wounded out of his entire force. It was the kind of lopsided victory that seemed impossible given the relative strength and experience of the two armies. Yet it had been achieved through tactical brilliance that turned apparent weaknesses into devastating strengths. But the numbers only tell part of the story of what made Cowpens such a remarkable victory. Morgan had achieved something that military theorists said was impossible. He had used the supposedly inferior forces to completely destroy a superior enemy through pure tactical innovation. He had taken what conventional wisdom regarded as the weaknesses of his army, the unreliable militia, the mixed composition of his force, the lack of formal European training, and turned them into the keys to victory. The psychological impact of Cowpens extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. For 2 years, British arms had seemed invincible in the Southern theater. Tarkenton, in particular, had been a figure of absolute terror, whose very name could scatter American forces. His destruction at Cowpens shattered the myth of British invincibility and proved that American forces could not just resist, but completely defeat the finest troops Britain could deploy. Tarkenton himself barely escaped the field, fleeing with a small remnant of cavalry, as his entire command disintegrated around him. Man who had built his fearsome reputation on ruthlessly pursuing and destroying American forces now found himself in headlong flight, his military career in ruins, along with his command. Bloody band had finally met his match in the old frontiersman from Virginia. The strategic consequences of Morgan's victory rippled throughout the Southern theater and beyond. When Cornwallis learned of Tarkenton's catastrophic defeat, he was forced to abandon his planned invasion of North Carolina and pursue Morgan's forces instead, beginning the campaign that would eventually lead British arms to Yorktown in ultimate surrender. More immediately, Cowpens provided a template that other American commanders would follow throughout the remainder of the war. The idea that militia could be effectively integrated with Continental forces in conventional battle, that tactical flexibility could overcome superior numbers and training, that American forces could take the offensive and win decisive victories. All of these concepts, proven dramatically at Cowpens, influenced American military thinking for generations to come. The victory also restored American confidence throughout the South after the disasters of 1780, Charleston's fall, the Camden defeat, and Tarleton's string of victories had convinced many that the cause of independence was lost in the southern colonies. Cowpens proved that British forces could be beaten decisively, that American leadership could outthink and outfight their opponents, and that independence was not just a dream, but an achievable goal. Perhaps most significantly, the battle showcased uniquely American military virtues that would characterize the nation's armed forces for centuries to come. Morgan's willingness to trust his men with unconventional tactics, his deep understanding of the psychological makeup of citizen soldiers, his ability to adapt European military methods to American conditions and American character, these became hallmarks of the American military tradition. Daniel Morgan himself became a legend whose reputation extended far beyond American shores. The old frontiersman, who had been brutally whipped by the British Army as a young man, had returned to humiliate that same army through tactical brilliance that impressed military professionals throughout Europe. His victory at Cowpens stands alongside Hannibal's triumph at Cannae and other great battles of encirclement as a masterpiece of military art that transcended national boundaries. The battle also demonstrated the crucial importance of leadership at every level of command. Morgan's tactical brilliance would have meant nothing without subordinate commanders like John Eager Howard, Andrew Pickens, and William Washington, who understood their roles perfectly and executed them with precision under the most difficult circumstances. The victory belonged not just to one man, but to an entire team of leaders who worked together seamlessly. Today, the battlefield at Cowpens is preserved as a national battlefield park where visitors can walk the ground where this remarkable victory took place. But the lessons of the battle extend far beyond military history into the realms of leadership, psychology, and national character. Morgan's victory demonstrates the power of understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, of turning apparent disadvantages into decisive advantages, and of having the moral courage to attempt what others insist cannot be done. In the grand narrative of the American Revolution, Cowpens represents a crucial turning point, a moment when American arms proved they could not just endure, but triumph, not just survive, but excel. It was a battle that changed the entire course of the war, fought by citizen soldiers, led by commanders who understood that sometimes the most brilliant strategy is the one that breaks all conventional rules and dares to do the impossible. Thanks for joining US on History USA for this comprehensive exploration of the Battle of Cowpens, one of the most brilliant yet forgotten victories in American military history. This tactical masterpiece reminds us that our nation's greatest triumphs often came from thinking differently, adapting creatively, and never surrendering hope, even when the odds seemed utterly impossible. If you enjoyed discovering this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We have many more amazing forgotten battles and brilliant strategies from American history waiting to be explored. Until next time, keep discovering the remarkable stories that forged our nation's destiny.